Read this. The Warner Archive UHD exhibits extreme frozen grain halos and color timing issues of various sorts, in addition to over-processed mono audio that is more processed than past releases. All of this in spite of having better Dolby Vision HDR than a studio label release, and having outstanding encoding from Fidelity In Motion on both formats? What do you mean this has transfer problems and issues? It's gotten rave reviews everywhere. It's a multi-million-dollar Warner Studio restoration. It's there on the UHD, isn't it? Well, they can keep these perfect reviews. How come you always find stuff like this? I hope it really is a perfect transfer like everyone else says and might actually be an archival release. That'll be the day. Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video, I will of course be reviewing Warner Brothers' new 4K restoration of John Ford's iconic masterpiece, The Searchers, and its release on physical media by the Warner Archive Collection as their first ever UHD title, which, unlike the studio label, has received the original poster artwork for all of the artwork and slipcover and disc labels, encoding by Fidelity In Motion, who is regarded as the best in the business in terms of disc encoding, and also gotten the upgrade to Dolby Vision HDR. All of these are foreign concepts to the Warner Studio label, so all of this is a great positive for the Archive division moving its way into the UHD realm and being able to tackle one of the crown jewels in the Warner library, The Searchers of all things, as that first UHD title. So this is the opportunity for the Warner Archive division to once again show up the studio label, which it does in the technical realm in terms of the final end product having Dolby Vision HDR and, of course, Fidelity In Motion encoding. So both of those factors are a gigantic leap forward over what we see from the studio label. However, I can't say that this is the stupendous, amazing release that most of the other reviews have claimed, as I think there are a number of glaring issues, all of which are actually the same kinds of problems that plagued the studio label's release of North by Northwest on UHD, which was also from a brand new restoration of the original VistaVision elements. So here you have two of the most iconic films ever made, fully restored by Warner Brothers, at and around the same time using the same technology, and they're both VistaVision large format titles, and two of, if not the most iconic of all VistaVision titles. And unfortunately, both films have been handled the same way by the Warner Studio restoration efforts, and each displays the same problems. However, between the two presentations, these issues are at different levels of severity, and thankfully the archive release being encoded by Fidelity In Motion with a substantially higher bitrate overall, and having Dolby Vision HDR means that those issues from the North by Northwest studio release are tamed to at least a great degree. However, the overall issues remain in terms of the picture and audio restoration, which frankly should be giant red flags to any reviewer. But unfortunately, this stuff tends to be glossed over or missed entirely by most. So let's get on to the actual restoration process and this new 4K master and the overall picture quality impression you're going to get from this release. Now, The Searcher is no stranger to restorations. It has seen a variety of attempts at restoring the film to, at the very least, give a better video presentation or get a cleaner video master with more refined color timing. Some of these you probably couldn't quite call complete restorations, as they were more geared towards the video realm and in the past were much more limited, but there have been several distinct moments in time where Warner has gone to The Searchers to try and improve its standing on home video and make new masters, and also eventually make versions for theatrical screenings. So when you look at the history of The Searchers, it's basically 1991 for the Laserdisc release, and then the VHS versions made from that. That was the first attempt at doing a restoration of elements. Then the next one was in 1997 for the final Laserdisc,
and first initial DVD release. Then in 2006, we had the next go-around, which was a new higher-res scan, which was done for the deluxe DVD set, but this introduced a brand new and very controversial and frankly completely defective color grading, which was then very hastily addressed and tweaked to attempt a very quick correction for the 2006 as well extraordinarily early Blu-ray release, which itself was basically a port of the HD DVD release, as at that time Warner Brothers would usually just make one master and design it around the smaller parameters in terms of technical specs and size of the HD DVD format, as they were backing both HD DVD and Blu-ray at the time. So when they did this HD version of the flawed 2006 master, they did address some of the terrible color timing issues, which on the DVD had a very prevalent push towards yellows overall. That was removed, but that Blu-ray is what we've had ever since, and that was basically in some ways a kind of rush job, as this is an extraordinarily early launch title for Warner on Blu-ray, being it's from 2006, which is basically the start of the format. So the film has been long overdue for a revisit and a proper new restoration from the ground up, as all past versions, and even this version as well, each one has had its own particular quirks and issues. All the past masters have not only had color timing issues, but they've had different approaches to the color timing, so even that's not been consistent. And it's based around the format limitations and parameters of the time and the work that they could do. And while each one has gotten successively more detailed as the resolution increases and the level of scan increases, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's done to the best of everyone's abilities at the time, nor that the studio disc release was done to the best of physical media potential at the time. So the fact that we learned that Warner was embarking on a brand new high-res scan of the original VistaVision camera negative, having to be combined with other surviving elements to do a complete restoration from the ground up, was incredible news, as the Searchers has been stuck on that 2006 very early Blu-ray, which itself was just a tweaked version of the screwy 2006 DVD master, and didn't even have lossless audio. It was extraordinarily outdated. So it was fantastic news hearing that this restoration was taking place. And this new master is a lightning leap forward in all areas from what we've seen before. It is by far and away the most detailed that we've ever seen this film before. But that doesn't mean that it's perfect, nor that you should overlook the significant flaws and issues that it does have. Now, it must be stressed that the restoration did have to go back to the color separation elements, as there was significant damage in the blue layer in particular. That's what they identified in the press release and interviews. So they were having to go back to other elements to then recombine and try to get around the inherent wear and damage that had happened to the negative, which is something that obviously is going to happen after this passage of time. So there are some elements in this master that I think are just dictated by the elements in terms of some slight color and brightness fluctuation, and some spots that might seem as if it's a slight lower quality, which is a bit mitigated by the higher resolution of VistaVision as a process. Those issues are to be expected. I don't have a problem with any of that. In fact, I would much prefer getting a straight archival copy of something that was a version before they did all kinds of work to it, as I think due to the way that this was handled, that would actually improve some things. I think the issues in this particular restoration and its presentation here, it's really more from how Warner handled the overall process. And again, it's the exact same issues as I talked about in their North by Northwest restoration. So it's not anything new or anything to be unexpected from the Warner Studio label. I think what confuses this is that this is a Warner Archive release, and Warner Archive usually does their own work or supervises the scans that are then done and worked on at Warner's in-house motion picture imaging division. But more frequently in the past couple years, we've seen Warner Archive releases that are actually just versions of masters already worked on by the studio division, and that's been a trend that just gets increasingly worse as time goes on. So you pay for what you think is going to be a top-tier, well-executed Warner Archive disc, and what you get is typically a properly encoded Warner Archive version of a process studio master that might have excessive digital noise reduction, grain management, image processing, and of course, heavy overzealous audio processing, and any other sort of side effects of a master being prepared by the studio division. The archive typically does not do these practices, but occasionally, and this has gotten more and more, especially on some of the Hanna-Barbera animation releases they put out on Blu-ray, they have released things that have actually been done by the studio. So you get a Warner Archive disc, and instead of getting a lovely archival presentation as you would expect from the archive, you get an image, for example, that has obvious signs of management and processing. This isn't every release, but it's been a trend that myself and most others in the physical media community have been noticing, as it has just been increasing over time. So when you get to the searchers and you know that it's a brand new Warner full-scale restoration being handled by the Warner Archive with Fidelity In Motion and Dolby Vision, you go in expecting something stupendous. And the overall quality of this new master on the surface is indeed stupendous. The level of detail, again, is like nothing we've seen before. There are some issues caused by the condition of the surviving elements, which is to be expected. But on the whole, the color timing is such a significant improvement and so much more nuanced than the unbelievably outdated 2006 Blu-ray tweak of the defective 2006 DVD master that it, along with the detail increase, is going to be, I think, the main factor that blows people's socks off and makes jaws hit the floor, because this is the great American visual poet John Ford getting to work in VistaVision with large format photography for the one and only time in his career, in what is viewed as quite possibly not just Ford's most iconic work in terms of his westerns, but viewed by most as probably the most iconic of all American westerns. So in short, when you put this disc in, whether you're looking at the Blu-ray or the UHD, the leap forward in overall quality is such a lightning leap forward that I think everybody is able to very quickly agree this wipes the floor with everything that's come before in terms of the overall quality of the new high-resolution work and it being able to be presented in homes in terms of 4K resolution with Dolby Vision HDR. So I don't really have any issues with the actual scan work and the fact that this is such a leap forward in the overall visual spectrum. It's what they did after that is where you run into all the problems. As I said, the color timing is far greater and more nuanced than what we've seen before. However, it has some issues of its own. Some of it is most assuredly tied to the color fading of certain layers and having to mix in the original color separation elements. However, the way this was done, it doesn't seem like it was as nuanced as it could have been. A number of others have noticed some issues and quirks in some of the color, particularly in terms of skin tones in particular sequences, and other elements having a push or bias towards magenta in areas, and that's actually been a problem in some of the past masters. Some actually went very heavily on a sort of magenta bias. But then there are other moments in this new master that are quite soft. There's also some brightness fluctuation and color fluctuation in scenes between individual shots, which again may be part of the original elements in terms of what they were having to work with. But there's just enough quirks in the color timing and the overall appearance, especially if you're a videophile or a colorist, where it's enough that adds up to make you start to question, why are we running into some of this stuff? Or there might have been some ways to better sort of manage these elements so they weren't quite as noticeable, or a better way to actually handle the restoration of some of these moments. This isn't something that I would necessarily say is bad. It's just quite curious, really, that after such a full-scale, large format restoration that we would see this in the final result. And there are some sequences that display this more than others. The big one is primarily during the wedding scene that turns into a brawl outside. If you look at all of the characters' faces, that's where you'll see a lot of even some slight artifacting coming in, and just a general feeling of weirdness in the skin tones. That's the most prevalent moment, I think. Again, some of this does seem to be a symptom of the element issues. Another thing I thought was interesting is that the film does notably have a good number of day for night sequences, which have to be very carefully handled in any sort of restoration, and you have to use your best judgment to try and match how it was printed originally, and then think about the difference between prints and how they were projected in the 1950s and how the intended effect was supposed to be, and then how can you best match that in the video realm. And those have seen different approaches on every past video release of the film. I think they're handled a bit better here, but I still don't know if they're exactly perfect. But anytime you've got day for night, there's always some variation in how those are presented. Now, as I said, there are certain moments that do appear a bit soft. Some of that is seemingly inherent to the elements in the material, but then there's other moments where it's not just that the image looks soft, but it's as if there are certain portions of the image that are soft or even smoothed over. And just like North by Northwest, there is one particular scene that has, thankfully in the Searchers, it's just one shot, whereas in North by Northwest, it was the whole sequence. But here, there is one shot at about the hour and 43-minute mark. It's of Ward Bond, and it looks so degraded and smoothed over that it almost seems as if it had been hit with heavy grain management or DNR. I don't know what happened. I don't think anybody really knows what happened, but for whatever reason, this one shot, which repeats because it's a shot that then cuts away to another shot that looks perfectly fine, like the rest of the transfer, then it cuts back to this overly processed looking shot. It's really bizarre, and it sticks out like a sore thumb, and you will notice this on your first viewing. You can even see that it stands out when you're watching the 1080p SDR disc. I don't really know what happened here, just like I don't know what happened with the forest sequence in North by Northwest, and why both of these top tier restorations have not only the same issues, but each has one particular moment where it looks like somebody went to town trying to do grain management on a VistaVision film. It could be something having to do with the elements being degraded for that one shot, but that doesn't really make sense, as all the past releases and masters have never had a problem with this shot, and it's just one shot that repeats within a sequence, and the rest of the sequence is fine. So what happened there, I have no idea, but if that is not tied to the elements, that should be an immediate red flag. So for whatever reason, while the rest of the feature is lightning leap forward from what we've seen before, there is one shot that looks overly smoothed over and processed for whatever reason. Then we turn to the HDR presentation on the UHD disc, which of course is done in Dolby Vision and also has an HDR10 version. This is relatively tasteful. Thankfully, it's better than the overdone HDR on North by Northwest that has way too much in the highlight areas, but there is unfortunately a little degree of that here. It's mostly in the interiors where I felt it was a bit much, especially when John Wayne's Ethan comes into the house for the first time in the opening. You'll note that all of the items on the shelves, the fireplace, the brighter and whiter clothing, it definitely picks up the highlights of those more than it should, and it does seem to be too bright and thus distracting from Ford's incredible compositional style. So for me, I think there are certain areas in this transfer where the HDR is a bit too much. I think it's better in the Dolby Vision, as when you compare the Dolby Vision to the HDR10, the Dolby Vision is more nuanced and thus better, and this issue is not as prevalent as it is in the HDR10. But all you really have to do is switch over to the SDR 1080p disc to sort of get the idea of what I'm talking about, and just compare the two in both HDR and SDR, and you can see at least a degree of the difference between the two. Again, this is mostly confined to the interior scenes, as the film is, of course, mostly exteriors and stage work. It doesn't really seem to affect those all that much. So I was overall pleased with the HDR presentation, and extraordinarily pleased that Warner Archive was able to get Dolby Vision for this particular title, as if anything should require Dolby Vision and the red carpet treatment, it's The Searchers. So thankfully this wasn't a studio job that just got stuck with HDR10. But for me, I do think the HDR is just a little bit too much in terms of brightness on the highlights in the interiors, which is something that I thought was rather distressing, as it's one of John Ford's masterpieces, and if there's any sort of visual quirk, then I get immediately leery and cautious. And, it wasn't as bad as other Warner titles have been, but it's something that you just kind of expect going into Warner catalog releases that have HDR in terms of 4K masters. And thankfully, it's nowhere near as bad as North by Northwest was. Now, when comparing the UHD and HDR to the 1080p Blu-ray included in SDR, the Blu-ray is from the new restoration as well, so it has been newly transferred for SDR, also encoded by Fidelity In Motion. So both discs are, on a technical standpoint, made as good as they could be, with maxed out bit rates, as all disc releases should have. So this has none of the sloppy encoding or corner cutting of the studio label releases. So if you're only able to view this in 1080p SDR, this is still a giant upgrade over the frankly ancient 2006 Blu-ray master and everything that's come before. So even if you're not able to view the UHD, the included Blu-ray and the relatively affordable asking price is enough to justify the purchase. However, in comparing the two discs, you will notice that the UHD obviously has the uptick in resolution, but it's really so much greater in overall visual nuance and the overall nuance of the color and the dynamics of the visuals that I think this can be very much seen as really a demo title to explain the difference between the same master on a well-done 1080p SDR Blu-ray and a well-done 4K UHD with Dolby Vision HDR. So if you were to go back and forth between the two, I think this is very much a title that will show the extreme differences, even when it's a classic catalog film that does have some element issues baked in. So you may be thinking, well, all of that sounds pretty good, maybe not perfect, but that at least sounds like what we had hoped for. Unfortunately, I saved the worst issue for last, and this for me is the unforgivable part, and what immediately was a red flag as soon as I started the film, because it's in the opening shots of the searchers and it runs rampant throughout the entirety of the transfer. And that is the incessant and pretty much constant frozen grain halos that go on throughout the entirety of the searchers. This is an artifact that's typically caused by over-aggressive usage of digital noise reduction. It's becoming more and more prevalent as we move further into 4K as both a streaming format and UHD at home. But this is basically a side effect of grain management that hasn't been done to a very careful degree. And so what you have are entire portions of the frame where the actual grain will sort of lock up and stagnate. And it loves to do that around, especially people's heads and shoulders or moving objects. And so you will see entire portions of the image in terms of grain and noise start to get blocky and soupy almost, and it will lock up around, say, John Wayne's head in some of the iconic shots in Monument Valley. And this is something that you typically see occasionally in a transfer. And now that we have 4K televisions at home and watching a film on an OLED, especially with HDR, it really highlights this stuff. Whereas on 1080p, in terms of even the Blu-ray here, it's hidden a lot more. It's much harder to spot. It would have to be really, really bad in terms of size and severity for it to be more easily visible on a 1080p SDR disc. But on UHD, especially with HDR on an OLED, it's very glaringly obvious. Well, you would think that you might see a few examples of it, as we saw, unfortunately, on North by Northwest, which had quite a number of them, which really infuriated me, as anytime you see one of these on a master, I think it's a red flag and means that should be noted, and the overall picture impression should be then readjusted. But to have a great number of them, or through entire sequences, or through most of the transfer, as North by Northwest showed a good number of times, that's bad. Well, unfortunately, while The Searchers is a Warner Archive UHD release, which has better disc specs and a better finalized product, And it's better in some of these issues I've talked about so far than the studio label North by Northwest release was. Unfortunately, here on the Searchers, the grain haloing is even worse, and it is constant. Thankfully, you don't really see it in the interiors because the interiors are mostly dark, but as the film is mostly exteriors, you will see it throughout the whole transfer. And it's not like it's just at particular points. It's in the opening shot. It's in the entirety of the opening sequence. As soon as John Wayne's Ethan Edwards comes in, you just see all of the dust over the trail and over his head. It's locked all together, and it's sort of swarming back and forth. And then as all of the family members come out of the house, you see locked over their heads, you see the sort of frozen grain pattern. And this runs throughout the entirety of the transfer. And for me, it mars all of the work that's been done. I don't know why somebody thought this was okay. It is glaringly obvious. It does not belong in an instant of any of the classic catalog films, but of all things, to have this happen to the Searchers after putting all of this time and effort into a full-scale restoration with a high-resolution scan of the original VistaVision negatives, and it being Ford's one film in VistaVision, one of the most iconic visual experiences in the cinematic medium, that's perhaps the greatest example of Ford's visual poetry. I mean, it's just unforgivable. I don't know why this was not covered in most reviews anywhere. In fact, I don't know if I saw any reviews cover the incessant frozen grain halos that run throughout the entirety of the transfer. But they start from the opening of the film, the very first shot, and it runs all the way through to the end. It's not in every shot, but it is there as a constant, and you can see it, and it is very noticeable, especially since we're looking at a high-resolution scan on a 4K restoration master on a 4K UHD in Dolby Vision at home, where we have the benefit of being able to watch it on a 4K OLED television. So that's the major problem here. That's what's unforgivable. Yes, I have issues with some of the color timing, and there are some quirks that I don't know why exactly it was done that way, and some things that could have been done better, some things that were obviously tied to the elements. And then there's that one shot that looks super smoothed over for whatever reason. If that was all I had to talk about here, I could understand most of that, basically everything except the one shot that looks super processed for no apparent reason. Some things could have maybe been massaged or done a little bit better. Some things were tied to the elements having issues. That could all be considered understandable. But when you move over into the issue of the frozen grain and noise haloing, and it being this bad, and it being from the very first shot of the film. In fact, even the credits have a bit of noise under the credits, so I don't even know if the opening credits escaped it. But for this to start from the opening shot of the Searchers and run all the way through on and off, I mean, that's just, that kind of defeats the purpose, really. I thought it was bad enough on North by Northwest having it throughout the entire crop duster sequence, but here in the Searchers, the haloing's even bigger and even more prevalent when it appears. And it's right there in the opening shot, so it lets you know what you're in for, that this is going to run throughout. And so when you have that, I mean, at that point, why even bother having Fidelity In Motion doing a beautiful encoding job on both discs and having Dolby Vision HDR? Because you're shooting yourself in the foot by the actual restoration master itself having these awful frozen grain artifacts. I mean, it's really bad. It's not quite the Paramount Godfather 4K debacle bad, which is the worst I've ever seen, but if this even happened in one shot, I would be livid, because this is the Searchers. It's the same thing with it happening a number of times in North by Northwest, but this makes the appearances of this artifact in North by Northwest look like nothing, because this is throughout the whole feature from the very first shot. And I just find it, frankly, unbelievable that this was done and people thought this was okay, whether it's a sign of the grain management being more on the automated side than being done by hand. There's a variety of factors that go into this, and unfortunately, it's not like there's a reference book you can go and read about this stuff. You have to just try to piece it together yourself. But this, combined with the other issues I've highlighted, do indicate a general sense that the overall image has been managed and processed to a certain degree, and these frozen grain halos being so prevalent, that's the biggest giveaway. That's the biggest telltale sign that this has happened. And I would bet you that if you were able to look at least some version of the raw scan or a pre-cleanup or earlier version of what the Warner restoration was working on, it wouldn't have this particular issue. And frankly, outside of it not having, finalized color grading and having baked in issues with the color fading of the negative, I think it would look better, actually, because none of this stuff belongs in the searchers. It's not something that was part of the original production and finalization process. This is a modern issue that unfortunately is affecting more and more films as we see more and more newer masters. And it's all due to people not taking the time to go through as cautiously as they should and with as much reverence for some of the greatest works of art ever made. So this, for me, is the major problem of the picture, which really negates a lot of the positives of this otherwise gigantic improvement. It's as if they were running a race and they got, 80 to 90% there. You can see the finish line when you're watching this. You can see how it could have been perfect, and it's not. And that kills me, because it could have been perfect. It should have been perfect. And the cherry on top of the sundae of this release was that Warner Archive was getting to do it with Fidelity In Motion doing the encoding and having Dolby Vision HDR. So it was going to be everything a studio disc wasn't. But because this is a studio master, it's got all the problems baked in. And chief among them in terms of picture is the horrendously bad frozen grain artifacts that run throughout the entire feature as they start in the very first shot of the searchers. So let that sink in. Again, this is much harder to spot on the 1080p SDR disc, so if you're watching this film on the included Blu-ray, you probably won't notice this much at all. But if you're looking at the UHD on a 4K television, especially in the Dolby Vision HDR presentation, it's really noticeable. It's really prevalent, and you will see it pop up throughout the entirety of the film. And frankly, that's unforgivable. That is a gigantic problem and should have never passed any sort of quality control. But again, this is really more of a Warner Studio label master that merely has once again been given over to the archive, who did their best in terms of making the final disc product what every Warner release should be in terms of having proper encoding and Dolby Vision HDR. So with that distressing news about the issues in the new Picture Master out of the way, we then turn to the audio, which one would hope, as this disc only has a lossless version of the original mono mix of the film, would be a full archival restoration with no processing of the original mono mix. That'll be the day. Sorry, I couldn't resist. As The Searchers has had a history on home video of being overly processed, starting with the 1991 first restoration attempt on the Laserdisc. Every release from 1991 onward has had extreme amounts of noise reduction applied, basically removing most of the entire high end of the original mono mix, losing detail like crazy, and then depending on which version and which mastering you have, some, like the 1991 version, are EQ'd a bit differently. Also, in 1997, that track had significant noise reduction applied. The 2006 version version was a little bit better, but it still had heavy noise reduction. And so both the 2006 DVD and Blu-ray and the HD DVD as well, they had similar levels of noise reduction and processing, but thankfully it was a little bit better in some ways than what had come before. But every major, relatively modern available version of the Searchers had extreme audio processing to the original mono mix to such a degree that it was frankly ridiculous. So we turn to the new Warner UHD, this new restoration. Thankfully, there's no overzealous modern remix that would be destructive, and there's no, heaven forbid, Atmos remix of the Searchers. So we have another version of the original mono mix. And one would think, as seen in a number of other titles, that Warner has finally given us lossless versions of the original audio or restored a version of the original audio to physical media releases. One would think that at the very least this would be a solid version. But again, like North by Northwest, this has a similar issue of having a track with defects and issues that itself has been heavily processed. So you would think that either this would be, somewhat processed and noise reduced, or it would just be recycling the audio from the Blu-ray, just now in a lossless container. Unfortunately, it's neither of those. This is seemingly a new transfer of the same mono mix source element. There's some inherent wear, there's some inherent bits of hum, there's some inherent noise, and it also sounds quite thin because it has been so aggressively noise reduced that it is more noise reduced than anything in terms of video releases since 1991. So this is, quite frankly, just as bad as the frozen grain haloing issue in terms of the picture master, and it being such a destructive presentation of the fidelity of the original mono mix by basically having the entire high end of the track gone. As some have noted, there's nothing above the 8 kilohertz range. That's why it sounds so incredibly thin, even compared to the processed versions on past releases. That means that the audio is just as problematic, if not even more, than the issues that exist in the new Picture Master, which is insane. And again, the track itself has issues and defects that were not addressed. So this is just like the mono track on the North by Northwest UHD having things that were not addressed that should have been restored, and then that track having overzealous processing and noise reduction. So the mono mix of North by Northwest, the best version I've ever been able to find, is the 41-year-old VHS tape from 1984. The original mastering of the film is the most untouched version of the original audio track and has the greatest fidelity. Unfortunately for the Searchers, the same exact thing happened. So if you want a version of the original mono mix of the Searchers, one of the greatest films ever made, what you have to do is go back to before the 1991 restoration master was ever a thing. And so if you manage to track down the VHS release from 1990 or 1988, as it was the same tape pressed twice, I have the 1990 version, they have almost identical cover artwork. This is the last and technically highest quality version of the first iterations of the film, pre the 1991 cleanup attempt that first heavily processed the mono track. So this has essentially a clean, straight transfer of the mono track as is. So of course it does have some source limitations baked in, but that's understandable for a 1956 mono track. And you having to get it off of an analog track on an old analog release. This is just the VHS tape I picked up out of curiosity a number of years ago to look at the transfer and mastering. But comparing the VHS hi-fi of the 1988 or 1990 tape, whichever you have, to the new Warner Archive UHD is such a night and day difference. I think this is an incredible case study for those curious about how excessive noise reduction can damage a film's audio track. And again, every release after 1990, basically from 1991 to now the 2024 UHD, have heavy levels of audio processing and EQ and heavy noise reduction. So it's not like we've been able to properly hear the Searchers for a long time, but some have been better than others, and this new UHD is arguably the worst mastering of the audio. So That's another gigantic red flag and should never have gotten past quality control issue. But unfortunately, people don't seem to look at audio or care that maybe they're overdoing it in their processing and so-called restoration. So again, I had to go back to a VHS tape to find the most untouched audio presentation of the Searchers, and the fidelity difference is so night and day, it's like you're hearing the film for the first time, because suddenly there's all this high-end information and space that simply isn't there on most of the other releases, and simply is not there at all on this new mastering on the UHD. So the audio is a complete failure, because the audio has been so overzealously processed that it's even worse than how it's been processed in the past. So this continues the film's history of having overly processed audio, but here it's been made even worse. But it's in a lossless container, so it's lossless. And unfortunately, the Warner Studio division seems to think that as long as they make a track lossless, then that's all fans really care about, because they've been doing this for a while. They started doing this on Blu-ray, where they would update a film that had a lossy Dolby Digital track to a lossless track, such as Rio Bravo, but it was still the same over-scrubbed, over-processed audio, so it just defeated the purpose. It was just changing the container. So this over-processing of film audio needs to stop, and there needs to be a concentrated effort in people actually paying as much attention in restoring film audio as they do to film picture. Audio is just as important as picture and doesn't get the same focus or level of care, and this is another incredibly sad example of this happening. So again, if you want the best audio presentation of the Searchers, it's not on the UHD, it's not on the Blu-ray, it's not on the 2006 Blu-ray, it's not on the 2006 DVD, it's not on the 1997 DVD or Laserdisc, it's not on the 1991 Laserdisc, it's on the 1980s home video master that you can probably get the cleanest and best version of by getting the 1988 and 1990 VHS tapes and then capturing the hi-fi track. But of course, you have to have a high-quality tape copy, preferably a sealed copy that's not been run before, and the best quality VCR you can that has a really good audio output, as you're still going to be dependent on the tape condition and then the quality of the audio output on your VCR. But even in the transfer I've done of this copy that I bought at a local store for 50 cents a number of years ago, the quality difference is staggering. So the audio is just as much of a problem as some of the picture issues, and quite frankly, it may be an even bigger problem. So the audio is a complete failure. This should have never been released this way, and it's an insult to the film. And again, this is a case in point example, a perfect example of how film audio is not given proper respect and treatment, even in restoration, because 9 times out of 10, it gets overprocessed or hit with noise reduction or deemed insufficient, so they have to supposedly improve it for modern listening environments and modern expectations, which is wrong. That's not restoration. That's over-aggressive audio manipulation. Now, I would like to add a note that this being a VistaVision title, there's always the possibility that, of course, there could have been a Perspecta Stereo mix made or prepared for the film, whether it was used or not. There doesn't seem to have been one, given that this was not done for Paramount, who was the home studio behind VistaVision. And so, like North by Northwest, it seems that The Searchers was only ever released in mono. But I like to mention that, as on these sort of VistaVision particular cases where it was a film done outside of Paramount, there's always a possibility that a alternate Perspecta Stereo mix could have existed or been done at some point. But like North by Northwest, it seems that that's not the case. However, I just wanted to mention that possibility anyway. So now let's turn to packaging and artwork. Warner Archive, as usual, uses an original poster, which looks beautiful, and this has the new version of the Archive logo and a slipcover for the UHD release, which also includes the SDR Blu-ray, and they've also had a standalone Blu-ray release released as well at a slightly lower price point. The slipcover is very well done. It's very simple. It's almost got a sort of matte finish in a way, but it's high quality enough in terms of the slipcover overall being well done. And the spine keeps the title font. The rear is nicely done, very tasteful, and sort of keeping the sort of rustic red aesthetic of the front poster image. So it all goes together well. We have the text blurb and then the listing of the supplements with the information about the UHD format in a slight sort of a silver bar, but not given the sort of reflective quality that some slipcovers have. So it looks good in terms of it being a straightforward archive slipcover on an archive UHD. This looks very much like what you would expect for a Warner Archive, no frills, but we used original art slipcover, and what we always expected, I think, for a Warner Archive UHD release. Remove the slipcover to find the same beautiful poster artwork on the case art itself, and then the rear is the same, just without the text blurb, so it's a bit simplified, but well printed and looks great, and of course has the same spine. So I don't know if they're always going to have the slipcover, or it's just the initial copies will have the slipcover, and then eventually they'll transition to just having case only. So if you're into slipcovers, I would say, purchase this sooner rather than later, as it's still unknown if the slipcover will always stay in print with this release. Now, when we open to see the actual disc, we have basically an enlargement of the poster artwork. So that's, of course, supposed to be John Wayne and Jeffrey Hunter. But as you can see, as it's an enlargement of a poster image, it does mean that this is a little soft and indistinct looking, which, it looks good for a disc label. It's fine. You obviously get what they were doing, but I don't know if it's necessarily what I would have chosen for the actual disc label. But then the Blu-ray, as you can see, has the exact same image. So the only way you can tell the two discs apart on the label is you have to scrutinize and see one has the UHD logo and one obviously has the Blu-ray logo. So a lot of releases nowadays, especially a lot of Sony discs, will have a different image for the label of each, and I really wish they would have done that, as especially in the dark, if you're trying to pull a disc out, you're most likely going to pull the wrong one. So you do have to scrutinize on the label, as the actual image is the same. So overall, I think the art is very good, and it's very tasteful, and of course, using original poster artwork is always the way to go, and I think what should be done on all catalog titles. That's something Warner Archive has always done, and this is very much what I think we all expected from a Warner Archive UHD, should it ever come to pass. In terms of artwork overall, I don't know if this is necessarily my favorite version. I think the most impressive still is the rendering on the 1991 Laserdisc, giving a certain color cast and also having the expanse of a Laserdisc jacket. I'm also partial to the 1997 art, and there's no way you can have a bad cover for the Searchers unless you did some rushed Photoshop job, but having an original poster image for the art was definitely the way to go, and it looks really nice, and you get the benefit of having a nicely done slipcover as well. Now we turn to the supplemental features, which, as you see on pretty much all Warner Archive releases, is consisting of legacy extras with one or two slight additions. So thankfully there is something new here in terms of extras, but unfortunately there's not a new commentary or something that's really meaty about the actual production of the film. But since the legacy extras themselves were already relatively impressive, there is enough material to go through, especially if you're a newcomer to the film. But being that these are mostly legacy extras, they are of course in standard definition and have been put on the disc and are thus going to be upscaled, and so they're going to be rather noisy and not very good looking. We start with the 1996 introduction by Patrick Wayne, which also includes some clips from the film. This was done, of course, for the 1997 release and is standard definition, upscaled, extraordinarily noisy, and also picture boxed within your television screen. So it's great that they still included this, but of course it looks really crummy now, especially upscaled all the way to 4K resolution. We have the film's original trailer, which thankfully is in high definition. It is in the 1.78 ratio, like the Blu-ray and some of the past masters were, as opposed to the new restoration and this UHD having the more accurate theatrical 1.85 to 1. The trailer looks pretty good and has color timing that seems seems somewhere in between the SDR and HDR presentations of this release. So you can look at this and sort of get a different feel for how this film might have looked in other iterations. It, of course, has damage, hasn't been restored, and is seemingly the same old transfer that was on the Blu-ray release. But at least it is in HD and has been shown some attention, as frequently most trailers are just kept as old standard definition files and thrown on successive discs as time goes on. Next is the piece entitled The Searchers and Appreciation, which is basically Curtis Hanson, John Milius, and Martin Scorsese talking about the film in greater detail. This was done for the 2006 DVD supplements, and they bring their own wonderful insights into the film, and it's nice getting them sitting down talking about one of Ford's masterworks in greater detail and not as part of just being, small talking head clips in a documentary. So this is a full 31 minutes of the three going into greater detail on Ford's poetry. Also done for past releases and in standard definition is the documentary entitled A Turning of the Earth, which is narrated by John Milius and features a lot of behind-the-scenes footage shot for some vintage promotional pieces, which are also included on the disc. So this is something done for past releases. It's a bit more of a general overview in ways, in terms of it being more of a comprehensive documentary as opposed to the directors talking just on their own. So when you watch this in conjunction with the other piece, you have basically just over an hour of standard definition documentary and critical appreciation of the Searchers. So when viewed together, it's a solid overall supplemental experience, but this being the Searchers, you still want more. But thankfully, this has also been ported over. But of course, it is still a vintage video era documentary in standard definition, now just being put on this disc and now upscaled to 4K resolution. So it is definitely noisier. And obviously, if you were to view the original version on DVD, especially on a lower resolution screen, it's going to look better. But thankfully, that has been ported over. Next is the vintage promotional pieces I mentioned, which there are 4 of them in black and white. These were on past releases, and The Searchers is notable for really being arguably the first film to do this with a substantial amount of behind-the-scenes material of the set and the set's construction, and just overall having a sort of fly-on-the-wall perspective of one of the great films being photographed. These are promotional pieces that were designed to be run to essentially hype up The Searchers, and they're all hosted by Gig Young on a particular stage or something at Warner, I would guess, and then he just talks to one of the stars, for example. And so it's wonderful that we have these survive, and when you look at all of them together, it runs about 25 minutes for all 4. So these are fascinating to look at, to see a new approach at trying to promote a film and using the production itself more in the promotional materials, but then also getting to sit through and watch all of this and see all of this footage of the making of The Searchers. So even though it's black and white and obviously just being ported over, so it's not been newly scanned or anything, it's a nice little treasure to have and a fun aspect of the film's original promotional campaign. And then the last of the supplements is the Peter Bogdanovich commentary, which was done for the 2006 DVD and has been ported over to everything else. This is a solid listen, as of course Bogdanovich knew Ford and made an entire documentary being John Ford, and was a Ford disciple in a great number of ways, and again was relatively friendly with him for the last years of his life. So he does have a lot of nice insights, but most of his commentary tracks are very conversational and do have some gaps and spaces where there won't be any commentary, or he'll just sort of describe the action that's going on in the scene as you might naturally do when making commentaries. So some people criticize them for those reasons, which I can understand, but it's still a solid listen and does need to be included on all releases. So I still think it's a solid commentary. I think the best and most rewarding aspects are his own insights and his personal relationship with Ford and Wayne as well. So that's the real draw of the commentary, I think. And that's always where I've gotten the most rewarding aspects from it overall. But it's still a nice track to return to when you rewatch the film. But I do really wish they had gotten a critic to come in and do a real heavy-hitting commentary as a second commentary track, which Warner Archive has done on occasion. If I could have done anything on the supplements, I think that's what I would have done. Whether they got one of the usual people they like to get, or I just imagine what it would be like to have a Sir Christopher Frayling commentary track for The Searchers, where it would be basically a book and a commentary track, as he's done, of course, the Leone commentaries and one for the Magnificent Seven. So us Western geeks can only think of all the various supplements we might make if it was us getting to at least do something. And I think having a new commentary to add would have been the easiest thing to do. But fret not, we do actually have 2 new supplements. The first is admittedly very short. It runs about 45 seconds, and it's footage from a newsreel of the actual premiere of The Searchers. Basically, you see John Wayne and some of the cast arrive at the front of the theater, and that's it. So it's very short, but it's a nice inclusion to give you that perspective of seeing the film's premiere, and it's just nice that we even have this at all. It is in high definition, so it obviously was more newly transferred. So unfortunately, that's it for the first of the new supplements, but that is made up for a little bit by the second, and what is frankly the major draw of the supplements, which is basically an entire reel of outtakes. This is unfortunately silent, so it's got music running under it, but this is raw camera takes with, starting with the slate board. And then you see several scenes and sequences being run through, and it's just takes that were spoiled or not used for whatever reason. This is priceless material. This is a treasure for all of us John Ford fans. And it's also in full aperture, so it's in 1.37. So you see obviously more around the frame that you're not supposed to see. Especially there's quite a bit of headroom dead space on the top of the frame that was intended to be masked out. VistaVision was a variable aspect ratio process, so you could frame it different ways, but this is just fascinating to be able to see from a compositional standpoint alone, seeing Ford working within this new format, but seeing basically the raw image that was running through the camera. So you get to glimpse more of the set and the set workings. You also get to see the actors, break character and things. Of course, it's silent. There is, of course, wear and damage to be expected, but also the color is quite interesting as it displays aspects that aren't part of the restored 4K master, but it itself is not restored footage, and so you obviously can't look at the color of this outtakes reel as a reference, but at least it's another sort of alternate glimpse into even the color timing of The Searchers. So this is just priceless material. It's amazing that they found and unearthed it. It's like seeing the bits of extra outtake and additional camera tests and set footage that Warner unearthed for Casablanca, for example. So this is astounding. It runs about 12 minutes or a little bit under 12 minutes long, and it's basically a couple scenes and pieces. But to again mention the color, rather interestingly, it has some of the wedding sequence, and you can actually see in the outtake footage it doesn't have any of the skin tone color timing problem. So if you were curious about seeing a version of that sequence to see if you could tell if that was something that was in another version of the film in that particular sequence in some of those shots, you can actually look at the outtakes reel on the disc and actually start to see a different version of that scene without that particular color timing issue in the skin tones. So since we have all the other legacy supplements on past releases, the draw of the new supplements is the 45 seconds of seeing footage of the premiere, but most of all, it's the nearly 12 minutes of raw outtakes from The Searchers, which, just that is worth the purchase price of the whole disc alone, because it's outtake footage from The Searchers. It's the raw footage, and you're getting to see more of the set that you weren't supposed to see, so you can really look at this and examine Ford's composition in the film and compare. So it gives you all this material to analyze like crazy, and it's just priceless. Even when you see the boom mic coming into the top, because this is the full camera aperture essentially. And again, this footage is not restored. It does have some color fading and has plenty of wear and damage, but still, the fact that it's here and it was scanned in HD and is here in 1080p, it's a treasure. So really, that's the main draw of the supplements, because the other element is 45 seconds of the premiere, and then everything else is just the same legacy supplements we had on the Blu-ray in 2006 DVD release. And it should be said that, as is common with most UHD releases, all of the supplements are on the Blu-ray disc except for the commentary track that is on the UHD and the Blu-ray disc. So to summarize, the 4K UHD and Blu-ray combo release of The Searchers by the Warner Archive Collection, this is, I think, another Warner Studio master that has been handed over to the Archive division to be handled. It was a bit surprising to see that one of the most iconic crown jewels of the Warner library was being allowed to be released by the Archive division, and as their first UHD. This would be one of the catalog crown jewels you would expect the studio label to hang on to, and then release a substandard version with corners cut, as is typically seen on studio label discs, like they did for North by Northwest. Otherwise, the Archive could have released that in a properly encoded UHD with Dolby Vision, but it would have had the same baked-in issues as it was a studio master, so it would have the same frozen grain halos and the same overprocessed, not restored mono track, and that's the same stuff we see here on The Searchers. So unfortunately, the only benefit you get of The Searchers being a Warner Archive release is the fact that the disc encoding is exceptional, and Fidelity In Motion did a fantastic job on both the Blu-ray and the UHD with maxed out bit rates, so that's not a problem. And this UHD does have Dolby Vision, which the studio label does not do. So those are your two benefits. Plus, the Archive release has original poster artwork. Those are the upsides here. That's what makes this different from The Searchers being a studio label release, as everything else, unfortunately, is a typical Warner studio problem. So unfortunately, I don't think the Archive got to actually be much involved in the technical process, as had they been, I don't think we would have had the same level of some of these issues, but even the audio would probably still be the same, as even Warner Archive doesn't always pay attention to the fidelity of presentation of the original audio. It's sort of hit or miss on a Warner Archive Blu-ray if it will have a really good sounding version of original audio, or a processed version, or a new transfer that's either left alone or processed, or if it will just reuse what was on the DVD. You don't really know until you actually get it in your hands and then compare it to past versions. So even the Archive has a sort of spotty history of audio fidelity, but so does every studio and label. That's nothing new. As I've said, audio is not given the same level of care and respect and attention as picture gets. I'm still extraordinarily happy that The Searchers was released by the Archive, as we do get the benefit of the disc releases having perfect disc encoding, the UHD getting Dolby Vision, and getting original poster art. These are things that the Archive continually does better than the studio label in almost every single example. And this is how every studio label release needs to be. The studio label should follow the doctrines and practices of the Archive division, who shows them up at pretty much every turn. So that's the good side of this. And the other good side is that the actual restoration itself is such a dramatic leap over what the past releases and masters and restorations were able to do. It's just that they fumbled the ball quite substantially in both picture and audio in certain areas. So you can see the finish line. You can see how this could have been perfect, or it could have been as good as one would expect a Warner Archive UHD of The Searchers from a new high-resolution, full restoration from the original VistaVision camera negative should be. But it's not 100% there. They really missed the mark on certain areas, which overall means this release is one that really troubles me. It could have been done perfectly. It should have been done perfectly. All of these issues were avoidable. And all of them are hallmarks of how the Warner Studio division doesn't handle their catalog restorations and then the 4K masters and overall presentations as carefully as they should, and without a necessary degree of quality control. The Archive division does try really hard in their efforts, but they are a small cog within the giant Warner corporate machinery. And so they have improved what would have been a standard Warner Studio label release by giving us original poster artwork, by giving us Dolby Vision in terms of the UHD, and by getting Fidelity In Motion to do their usual outstanding encoding work on both Blu-ray and UHD. So technically, Warner Archive did their part. They were just given substandard materials and overprocessed materials by the Warner Studio division, as keeps happening with Warner Archive releases. So again, the issue is not with Warner Archive, and I hate to have to criticize this release so much, but it really needs to be criticized. This does not deserve the perfect rave reviews it's gotten everywhere. And especially, the audio needs to be properly restored. Again, the fidelity difference between the 2024 UHD and the 1988/1990 VHS hi-fi track is so astounding that it's appalling. And it's even worse than the frozen grain halos that themselves are the unforgivable sin in the picture quality of this supposed top-tier restoration from the Warner Studio division. So this is, unfortunately, an extraordinarily compromised release when it shouldn't have been. I still have to recommend it because it is such a lightning leap forward in picture over past versions, but you will have to live with the inherent quirks, visual issues, and the terrible frozen grain halos. That's just what we're stuck with. However, since it's the Warner Archive division handling this, we get the benefits of their efforts of making sure that the disc side of things was done as well as it could be. So the encoding is phenomenal from Fidelity In Motion. We have original poster artwork on the artwork case and slipcover, and we have Dolby Vision HDR on the UHD, which the studio label would never do. They only allow Dolby Vision on the streaming versions because of the backwards Warner's gonna Warner logic. The other reason why you should purchase this is, of course, the new supplements, but really it's just because you get that incredible priceless treasure of the reel of outtakes in high definition. That is worth the whole purchase price of the disc because that material is so priceless. And that combined with the overall home video upgrade in terms of the picture quality presentation being so far ahead on a technical level of all past versions. Those are the main draws. But you got to live with the inherent headaches and negatives and, frankly, errors of Warner's handling of this restoration. And you're going to have to live with the frozen grain halos, which any one of which is unacceptable. But you've also got to live with the fact that the audio is actually a downgrade. This is arguably the worst sounding version of the Searchers in all of physical media. It's probably arguably between this and the 1991 Laserdisc attempt at mastering and adding unnecessary EQ and stuff. It's hard to tell which is actually worse, but the UHD has the most filtering of any of the monomix presentations. And thankfully, the older pre-restoration releases are quite inexpensive, so I would say that it's best to still have several copies of the Searchers, even if you're upgrading to the UHD release, because, again, the audio is such an incredible downgrade that you need past releases. And, of course, if you want all of the supplements, you do have to have the 2006 Ultimate Collector's Edition DVD that I have here, which has a number of really important printed supplements, including the Dell comic book adaptation. So if you want absolutely everything, you need the Ultimate Collector's Edition on DVD for the wonderful printed supplements, which, of course, the Archive isn't able to do as their budget doesn't even allow them to generally do new on-disc extras. So technically, to have a proper definitive version of the Searchers on home video in terms of physical media that has every single bit of printed material and supplements, you need the new Warner Archive UHD and Blu-ray, you need the 2006 2006 Ultimate Collector's Edition DVD for the printed materials, and you need either the 1988 or 1990 pre-restoration VHS tape for its hi-fi mono track, which, as far as I know, is the best presentation of the original mono mix of the Searchers without any major tomfoolery applied to it, and thus it has the best fidelity for the original audio of the Searchers, which is insane. But unfortunately, that's the level of which film audio is not properly respected. Again, I hate to be so negative, as this is still, I think, a release that everyone should have in their collections. I think it's a release everyone should purchase, as the overall picture quality improvement is so vast compared to what we've had before that it's really essential. But to have a proper viewing experience, you need to capture the pre-restoration audio and sync it to this release to have the best audio you can, and you'll still have to live with the visual headaches of the Warner Studio Master having baked-in problems, the worst of which being the frozen grain halos. But again, there are enough visual quirks that start to add up that frankly shouldn't really be there, or should have been addressed better, but the frozen grain halos are unacceptable. Again, I don't think the Archive did anything wrong here. I think they did their usual best possible presentation job. They are merely the ones handling essentially the distribution of this restoration master, and they got Fidelity In Motion to do a great encoding job. So again, I think the Archive and Fidelity In Motion did their usual excellent work. This all seems to be tied to the same issues we see time and time again with the Warner Studio division. And this is basically their master being released through Warner Archive. So the final product is better than what a studio label product would have been. But it's still a studio label master, and it has these issues which are unacceptable and shouldn't be there and should be highlighted. So unfortunately, this is not the perfect dream disc we all hoped it would be as soon as this announcement hit, and all of us classic film geeks and physical media enthusiasts literally were over the moon. But there was at least some trepidation I had in terms of this still technically being a Warner Studio restoration, and I especially was leery that the audio would not be properly treated, but I certainly didn't expect it to get, almost kind of massacred in noise reduction. So unfortunately, while I still have to recommend this release, it is extraordinarily problematic, and all of these are issues that could have been avoided. And that's why this is so frustrating, because you can see this being a perfect release. You can see how they got like 80 or 90% there and then just fumbled it due to ostensibly not caring enough to get every last detail right and to make sure that they didn't overdo some things. And it's like this practically every time with the Warner Studio division. Every time they do this stuff, and it's the same things over and over again. All of these issues are the same things we saw on the North by Northwest UHD. It's not the same degree in each of these problems, but it's the same exact issues. And so on both of these full-scale, from the ground up, VistaVision negative, high-resolution scan, full restorations of two of the most important, famous films ever made, to not have it done to the best of everyone's ability across the board, it really kind of defeats the purpose of doing it in the first place. So I don't think Warner's ever going to change, unfortunately. This seems to be their modus operandi, and thankfully here the Archive division did their part in making this release as good as they could make it to their quality standard, which is far and away above the Warner Studio quality standard, which seems practically non-existent. So this is unfortunately a must upgrade, but keep in mind the extraordinary drawbacks of the new release, while also making sure you get an old VHS copy from the 1980s to have proper audio. Why is this a thing? So unfortunately, my thought about the audio probably not getting properly restored was correct. So again, I hate to be so negative, but all of this was completely avoidable. And for this to happen to the Searchers of all films is just it is upsetting because I think a lot of the film's fans, and of course myself included, if we had been given the opportunity, we would have done our darndest to make this release as best as humanly possible. Had the Archive division been able to actually handle everything themselves, they would have done their usual efforts to make the transfer as good as humanly possible. So I think, unfortunately, this is just another Warner studio master that was then passed over to the Archive division. So in some ways, I guess we have to be thankful that the Archive got to do the disc release. So at the very least, we got great encoding and Dolby Vision, but it's still an overprocessed studio master with issues of its own. Thankfully, it's better from a technical perspective than all of the past releases in terms of picture, but it's got new issues of its own. It's got unforgivably bad elements. It's got HDR issues. And then it's got the overprocessed to death audio track, which is, again, a downgrade from past releases. So unfortunately, those are my thoughts on the Warner Archive release of the masterpiece, The Searchers, on UHD and Blu-ray. I wish I didn't have to be the bearer of bad news, but somebody had to say it, because this is not what it should be. And again, I don't think it's the Archive's fault at all. I think they did the best that they could. I think it was just baked into the source master they were given. And with this being a full, complete restoration from the ground up, all of this is unacceptable and shouldn't have happened, and frankly wouldn't have happened at other studios. You know, if this was Sony doing this, we wouldn't be talking. The fact that the 4K master and restoration of The Searchers in VistaVision is not to the quality standard that Sony was able to achieve with their 4K restorations of the landmark Bud Bedecker renowned cycle of Westerns, which were all B films on lower budgets in standard 35mm, and the last two being in scope. And those are breathtaking in terms of the 4K presentations that Criterion released in their box set. That's the quality standard The Searchers restoration should be at, and it is not. So this is a large format VistaVision title that's not at the same restoration quality standard as what were originally low-budget B-Westerns in the 1950s. That shows the difference in quality of restoration efforts from start to finish between studios. That's why Sony is the industry leader and has been for decades. In short, if you want to see some of the greatest Westerns ever made, beautifully restored in 4K resolution with gorgeous, breathtaking, perfected 4K UHD presentations with Dolby Vision HDR that have not one visual problem, that have not been managed in any way, that have no issues with the grain, no issues with the HDR presentation whatsoever. If you want to see the picture quality at the level that the rave reviews of The Searchers UHD indicate, then you need to get Criterion's box set release of the renowned Westerns to see Sony's breathtaking 4K restorations of the renowned cycle of films made by Bud Bedecker, Randolph Scott, and Harry Joe Brown. These are a benchmark in terms of 4K UHD picture quality, especially for iconic Westerns. This is the level of picture quality we should expect from The Searchers on UHD. And of course, The Searchers being VistaVision, it should go far beyond what these films are, being standard 35mm. But Sony did the picture restoration job perfectly on these, and Criterion handled the UHDs well. This is the classic Western UHD that should be raved over for having absolutely perfect picture quality. This still remains one of, if not arguably the best UHD presentation I've ever seen, and thus one of the greatest home video picture presentations I've ever seen. These are so breathtaking, it feels like you're seeing a brand new print that was made on the original release, and going even beyond what that would have been capable of. These have no signs of processing or management. This is the quality level The Searchers on UHD should have been at in terms of the restoration and presentation side of things. It is not. So if you want a perfect UHD of one of the greatest Westerns ever made, you've actually got 5 of them to look at, but they're all from Sony and not Warner. So as you can tell, I definitely have gotten a bit hot and bothered over this, and I have done even more research than what I typically do. But all of what I have noted and discussed in this review was something I noticed on my initial viewing of the UHD. It wasn't something that I had to scrutinize frame by frame over. This was all stuff that was readily apparent when I was first watching the UHD as soon as I got it in the mail that day. It was just afterwards that I kept going through and making further comparisons and doing further research. And as I continued that process, I got more and more frustrated, and then that crossed over into being infuriated. So again, I want to stress that I think this is all tied to the Warner Studio division and not Warner Archive. And that also this release is still such a dramatic leap forward in picture over what we've seen before that I still think it is essential for people to pick up. But again, you are going to lose out in the deficiencies of the audio and the other issues of the picture. But also you are at least getting the benefit of the Warner Archive's better encoding with Fidelity In Motion and their usage of Dolby Vision on the UHD, plus getting the reel of outtakes. So there are positives, but do keep in mind there are severe issues with this, and it is not a perfect 5 out of 5 disc in any category, which is unfortunately what you're seeing indicated in pretty much every other area of the physical media section of the internet. And that's why I wanted to go into further detail, and that's why I took the time to do even more research and make even more audio comparisons than I would normally, because I was flabbergasted that this is how it turned out. But again, I want to stress, I don't think this is the Archive division. I think they did the best they could with what they were given, and unfortunately, this is the result. A perfectly executed UHD and Blu-ray release on the disc side of things of a substandard Warner restoration master, and even more than that, a criminally bad audio presentation. So again, at the very least, I think you should definitely pick up the new UHD and Blu-ray combo release of the Searchers from the Warner Archive, but also to have proper audio, you should have one of the pre-restoration video releases from the 1980s to then sync that audio track with the UHD to at least have the best audio you can get. So as always, I hope my babbles about classic films, the incredible poetry of John Ford's iconic works, and physical media has been at least somewhat fun and informative. I hate to have to be so negative in a review like this of something that I still think is an essential upgrade title for certain reasons, but again, somebody had to say it, because this is not what I expected with this being a Warner Archive title. But again, I don't think the Archive had anything to do with these issues, and I think they handled their side of things admirably and did a better job, as they always do, than the studio label would have. I think all of this is another shining, terrible example of how the Warner Studio division doesn't care about certain aspects and doesn't care about getting things right and doesn't care about having the necessary level of quality control that they should have for some of the greatest works of art ever produced. And they never once will match the level of quality care that Sony puts into their restorations, which is why Sony is always viewed as the industry leader among studios. And to even compare the Searchers UHD to the Sony restorations of the Renown cycle, it's just a joke, because those 4K masters, in terms of their picture presentation, those are perfect. And I never say that about a disc release or a master or something. That's something I can always point to as, that is a benchmark. That is a gold standard. The Searchers UHD isn't, because it's Warner and they don't do those things. So unfortunately, I still think the Searchers UHD is an essential purchase, because it is the Searchers, and at least there is a great deal of improvement over the past video releases in picture, in spite of the frankly unacceptable issues that are present in this 4K master. So don't let me dissuade you from still picking this up, but The audio is the downgrade portion in terms of it being actually even more deficient than other releases. So that's where you will have to get into making your own fan preservation version with the audio from before the film started going through overzealous audio restoration. So as always, please do keep supporting both studios and boutique labels by buying films on disc, even when they are problematic as heck, such as the release of The Searchers on UHD due to the actions of the Warner Studio division. Because in purchasing films, you are, of course, helping to encourage and support further restoration work, but also to help keep both physical media and film culture itself alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Thinking that The Searchers will finally have a perfect, proper physical media release that is fully archival without any sort of technical problem and perfectly archival picture and sound on a perfectly executed physical media release. That'll be the day.
A film geek will search his physical media transfers. Go searching through every disc, an archival transfer he hopes he'll find. But where, oh video gods,